The Roman Empire. At its height, Rome controlled most of the known Western world, but the mistake that ultimately broke it was not one dramatic failure. It was slow internal rot. The empire grew so large that governing it from a single center became impossible. Emperors split it, then fought over the halves. Currency was quietly debased to pay for endless wars, which triggered inflation that eroded public trust in the state. Soldiers recruited from outside Roman society had no deep loyalty to Roman ideals. They followed whoever paid them. By the time the final blows came from outside, the structure had already been hollow for generations. The Aztec Empire. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519 with a few hundred soldiers, the Aztec Empire had millions of subjects and a powerful military. What destroyed it was not Spanish steel. It was the enemies the Aztecs had made at home. Decades of demanding tribute and sacrificial victims from neighboring peoples had built up enormous resentment across the region. Cortés understood this almost immediately and forged alliances with those groups, particularly the Tlaxcalans. The army that ultimately broke Tenochtitlan was mostly made up of indigenous peoples who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. An empire surrounded by people who hate it is always one crisis away from collapse. Napoleon's France. Napoleon Bonaparte built one of the fastest rising empires in European history, and he destroyed it with a single decision, invading Russia in 1812. The campaign was not irrational on paper, but the execution revealed a critical flaw in how Napoleon led. He believed his personal military genius could override geography, logistics, and climate. Russia simply retreated, burned its own supplies, and waited. The Grande Armée of over 600,000 men entered Russia in summer and returned in winter as a broken fraction of itself. After that, every coalition Europe had been unable to hold together suddenly found the unity it needed. Overconfidence in one man's judgment left no system capable of correcting the mistake. The Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in history through discipline, adaptability, and a remarkably organized military structure. The mistake came after him. There was no stable succession system, no clear rule about who led after the Khan died. His empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, who initially cooperated but gradually pulled in different directions. Within 2 generations, the unified Mongol Empire had fractured into 4 separate khanates that sometimes traded, sometimes fought, and eventually absorbed into the cultures around them. The same organizational genius that built the empire never turned inward to solve the most basic political problem. What happens next? The British Empire. Britain's critical mistake was not losing colonies. Empires always lose colonies eventually. The deeper error was treating its imperial economy as permanent. For over a century, Britain extracted raw materials from its territories, manufactured goods at home, and sold those goods back. The entire domestic industrial base was built around that cycle. When the colonies began asserting independence through the mid-20th century, Britain had not developed a self-sustaining economic identity separate from empire. The transition out of imperial power left the country economically exposed in ways that other European nations, which had industrialized differently, did not face in the same form. The Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans governed an enormous, multi-ethnic, multi-religious territory with a degree of practical tolerance. Different communities largely managed their own affairs under the millet system. The fatal mistake came in the 19th century when the empire, under pressure from European powers and internal nationalist movements, tried to centralize and modernize too quickly and in the wrong direction. Rather than evolving the structures that had made diversity manageable, reformers pushed toward a narrower Turkish national identity that alienated Arab, Armenian, Greek, and other populations simultaneously. The empire ended up neither traditional enough to hold its old loyalties nor modern enough to compete with European states. The Spanish Empire. Spain built its empire on American silver, and for a time that seemed like an unbeatable advantage. The mistake was never building anything beneath it. Rather than investing silver revenues into productive industry, Spain used the wealth to fund wars, maintain an enormous bureaucracy, and import goods it could have manufactured at home. Domestic production atrophied. When the flow of silver slowed and eventually declined, there was no diversified economy to fall back on. Other European nations had been using that same period to develop trade networks, banking systems, and industrial capacity. Spain had wealth without structure, and structure is what survives. The Macedonian Empire. Alexander the Great conquered territory at a speed the ancient world had never seen. from Greece to Egypt to the edges of India, in roughly a decade. The mistake was entirely personal and entirely fatal. He never built institutions capable of surviving him. There was no clear heir, no designated system of governance, no administrative structure that existed independently of Alexander's own authority. When he died at 32, his generals divided the empire almost immediately. Within 50 years, what had been the largest empire of its age was a collection of competing kingdoms fighting over the pieces. Greatness built entirely around one person has no future beyond that person. The Ming Dynasty. China under the Ming was one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, with a massive navy, sophisticated bureaucracy, and enormous agricultural output. The mistake was the decision to turn inward. In the early 15th century, China had ships larger and more capable than anything Europe would build for another century. Then the voyages stopped. The government restricted maritime trade, dismantled much of the navy, and focused almost entirely on internal stability. By the time European powers arrived at China's borders with trade demands backed by military force, the Ming had lost the technological and naval edge that might have allowed them to engage on equal terms. Choosing isolation over engagement meant choosing ignorance about how the outside world was changing. The Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great founded the Achaemenid Persian Empire on a relatively unusual principle for its time, a degree of tolerance for local customs, religions, and governance structures. It worked. The empire held together territories with vastly different cultures because those cultures were not forced into a single mold. The mistake came later under rulers who abandoned that principle. When Xerxes destroyed Babylonian temples and declared himself not king of Persia, but king of all peoples in an absolute sense, he removed the practical accommodation that had kept conquered populations cooperative. Then came Alexander. An empire built on flexibility does not survive rulers who forget why that flexibility existed. The Soviet Union. The Soviet state lasted longer than most empires in the traditional sense, but it carried a structural flaw from nearly its beginning, an economy built on ideology rather than feedback. Central planning required that information about what was working and what was failing flow accurately upward through the system. But reporting failure in a state that punished failure meant that accurate information rarely reached the people making decisions. Leaders operated on a distorted picture of reality. Resources went to prestige projects, while basic supply chains struggled. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to introduce transparency through glasnost, the gap between official narrative and lived reality was so large that openness itself accelerated collapse. A system that cannot hear the truth cannot correct itself.